Welcome all, and thank you for joining today's Adabri webinar. My name is Matt Holdstock, and I will be your webinar host today. In today's session, we'll take a look at the Sustainable Wine Growing Australia dataset with a webinar titled, What Can You Learn from Vineyard Data? In the spirit of reconciliation, the Adabri acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'd also like to acknowledge Wine Australia for providing funding and support for the Adabri webinar program through the Extension and Communication Project. But before we jump in and make a start, a couple of quick reminders to anyone who is new to the Adabri webinar program. If you would like to provide a comment or ask a question throughout, please click on the Q&A button on the Zoom toolbar, type in your question and click to send it through. We'll be holding the Q&A session at the end of this presentation, but feel free to send through questions at any stage throughout. A reminder also that this session is being recorded and the link sent through to you later to view via the Adabri's YouTube channel. For anyone who's just joined, welcome. Today's webinar topic is What Can You Learn from Vineyard Data? And it is a great pleasure to welcome Bryce Polly, a PhD candidate at the QUT Centre for Data Science. Bryce is an Australian mathematician and statistician. His research integrates Bayesian networks, expert elicitation, interpolation methods, and scenario analysis to evaluate operational decisions and market factors. Bryce's professional experience spans defence, health, and agriculture. His technical work includes cloud deployment, GIS, probabilistic graphical models, and machine learning pipelines. So with that, Bryce, if you're ready to start, I'll just get you to share your screen.
Yeah, thanks for that. Oh, all right. Thanks. Yeah, that was a lovely introduction. So my name is Bryce. I've worked alongside the Australian Wine Research Institute for the past 3 years through Sustainable Wine Growing Australia as a joint venture between Queensland University Tech and the Food Agility CRC. So I think it was a very good introduction, so I probably don't need to talk too much more about myself, but I'll tell you what we're going to talk about today. I'll go through sort of why we collect data, what we do with it, what we can do with it, and I'll go through some examples of those, so just general examples, and then I'll move into the research that we've done over the past 3 years with the Sustainable Wine Growing Australia data. So my association with Sustainable Wine Growing Australia has been through this research program. This is sort of their web of what they generally do, and I'm down there in the bottom right with the quantitative data set. So there's about 500,000 points of data in the set, and what we sort of sought to do was create these AI tools, these analytics, and do scenario assessments, then start to build these decision support tools to help growers. So I'll just go into initially some background and sort of statistical background. So why do we have data? What do we do with it? And why would you want to collect this sort of agricultural data? So it's a pretty standard process. That sort of scientific method a lot of people would be familiar with. You create some sort of hypothesis, you measure that, and then you demonstrate it. So you measure it against a control. So, and then you begin to inform people with that. Johann Friedrich Mayer was a pretty predominant first agriculturalist who did this. So he did a lot of hypothesizing about fertilizer, particularly crop rotation, lots of the things that we sort of used today, and yeah, essentially just measured the effect, informed people about the different types of fertilizers that were particularly useful for different crops, and when and where you should use things like crop rotation. So it's easy to take that sort of stuff for granted, but it's also hard to know what you're going to record as a preamble to that. So people knew fertilizer was good, but perhaps didn't know which particular fertilizer for which crops. So as a general rule, when you do record your data, especially within this sort of operational context, what you want to record are the things you want to improve. So Mayer went back, he recorded things like yield was one of the focus points for instigating improvements like crop rotation. And then you measure things around that. So you've got the decisions of how many years you'd have a crop on a particular paddock, when you would rotate it, what kind of fertilizer you would use for particular crops and such. And you try to measure as many factors as within that context as you can, because if you're not fully understanding the causal reason for why that effect is happening, it's a lot easier to retrospectively sort of mine that data to understand exactly what the cause was or what you can do or potentially any kind of decision that might help to improve the situation moving forward. So how does AI fit into all of this? So these types of tools that Mayo would have used, you could have done by hand, and up until around about the 50s or sort of the World War II era, people were doing all of this by hand. The original term for AI was coined back in the 50s by John McCarthy. It was mostly as a marketing sort of tool, but the essential reason for it was the amount of computational power that was added to these types of algorithms that people were doing allowed for people to sort of expand that into a lot more analytical styles that weren't viable beforehand. So AI really does just span a massive amount of different types of analytical tools. Essentially anything you can use by a computer, people try to pass off as AI. And there's a lot of different innate definitions in that. So I've got a very quick example here, inspired a bit by one of my friends who sort of says, AI is not killer robots. It's really just a whole bunch of spreadsheets. And he's absolutely right. On the left, there's something, an example of what you'd call a neural network. You have sort of these input layers, then you have a whole bunch of hidden layers that are just calculations across the things that you input into it, and then some sort of output layer. So on the right, I've just given the straight up the spreadsheet example of what this would look like. So in this example, it'd be something like if you were trying to remove a stain from a carpet, you've got your vinegar, you've got your soda or baking soda. That was the idea. So you could just say first column's whether vinegar worked or not, second column's whether your baking soda works. So if you look at the zeros, it's just nothing happened. So in the final sort of output column where you've got your output layer, you just say, yeah, look, if you don't use anything to clean it, it doesn't come out. If you use your baking soda to clean it, it does. If you use your vinegar, it does come out. If you use both together, they just combine to make water and it doesn't work. And that's essentially what it is, except with computers and some of these algorithms, we're able to do this within the millions of nodes. So we can add an innumerable amount of inputs to consider a lot of data to train these types of things on, and then compute so many different ways in which these variables interact. There's a lot more cleaning products out there than just vinegar and baking soda, and there's a lot more things you can spill on your carpet than just some made up liquid that happens to come out when you try and clean it. But the idea behind using this computational power to sort of tackle problems really did, as you can see in the 50s, became quite a predominant method moving forward in statistics, mathematics, and that sort of came to the birth of computer science. So Wald was a mathematician and he worked on some of these problems in World War II. This is a very classic decision theory problem where people employ these types of approaches, and essentially they recorded all sorts of data about planes during the war. Infamously, they recorded where they got shot. So the planes had come back, they had a look at it, and they would sort of say, well, they're getting shot on the tips of the wings, they're getting shot in the tail. How can we protect them more? We'll put armor on these places where they're getting shot so that they don't get shot down. Wald intervened and was asked about this problem, and he highlighted the fault with this, which is often one of the difficult problems people have within this type of decision theory and these statistical hypotheses, is that he proposed that they actually armor all the places where they're not getting shot, because the sample that they were collecting was from planes that were returning and so hadn't been shot down. So all of the data they were doing was quite the opposite of what their intention was. So things like the tail gun, where they weren't getting shot, or the engines or cockpit were a lot more vital to the plane's survival than the tips of the wings and such. And that proved to be quite an effective change to the aircraft. So there's a few things that people need to consider when they do these types of analysis, and that is things like the risk. If people are going to get shot down in a plane, it's quite a high risk, and you want to make sure you're getting your data right and you're not misattributing these outcomes. So the other thing is that people just make mistakes. You can use, with all these tools being so widely available, there's a lot of things that people can use and then sort of say that they achieved X, Y, Z, or there is some kind of effect that's happening, but it's not necessarily true. So one of the traps is certainly if there's lots and lots of data, a lot of people can then create these not purely causal inferences, or they can infer a lot of effects based on this data. So what can we do about this? You really do just establish that you try and stick as well as you can to that protocol that Mayer did. You try and keep input and keep your work quite visible to other people so that they can criticize it or introduce more variables to it that are more important and cut the fat from it as well. So within the research that we've done in the past 3 years, we essentially followed the same pitter patter of what you would normally see, that sort of hypothesize. So we established this baseline. We've already measured a lot of these effects through sustainable wine growing Australia, and so what we want to do is tease out what the important factors were, and then we want to describe how they interact with each other so that we're not making any of those mistakes. So these are what we call complex systems, and they are quite prone to those types of errors, especially when people do inference across what causes an effect on what. And then after this, we assess these scenarios to have a look at what can change, if any of these variables we can tweak to get different outcomes, and how sane those outcomes are, like whether people actually agree with the outcomes or not is quite an important step within that. So the data that we have, if you're part of Sustainable Wine Growing Australia, you'll be pretty familiar with it. Luckily, it's quite a long-lasting data set. So over 10 years of data, Australia-wide, as far as the wine growing regions are concerned. There's production data, operational data, and resource use data. So the first step within this, it is building our understanding of the variables and how they relate to one another. We used a lot of different techniques within here. So you try and build these types of nice, understandable relationships between the variables that we can see on the right. We do this through the use of a lot of more simplistic models like linear models, general linear models, ordinary least squares. Sometimes you employ things like clustering algorithms to understand where there might be particular ways in which you can partition the data, so you can cut it up and sort of describe particular things. And the same thing with the decision trees, so that they're quite good at that slicing the data. So one of the things we did find was the mixture of both of these was quite effective at teasing out some of these things. The biggest thing being the types of clustering we would see within the data. So the grouping of data was really communicated the types of regions someone would be in and the climate of those regions, which wasn't too unfamiliar to growers. So coming fresh out of sort of, I was working in health and federal government before this, and coming to agriculture quite fresh, I wasn't fully aware of how much the client would have that effect on the data. But luckily I was within the AWRI at the time, and I could hear a lot of the help desk phone calls and talk to the growers that were working there about the types of effects that climate and region had on the data. So we made these sort of maps of comparison points there. So we looked at the hot, the cold, the damp, the very dry regions and things like that. And it really started to be more of a cluster between those inland, warmer regions and the cooler coastal regions. But the question started becoming the sort of why behind the data. So after a lot of these transformations and having a look at this data set itself, we could, as you can see there's the red down at the bottom right is those warmer inland regions, and then as you move up to the top left there, you've got these sort of cooler coastal regions. And essentially we were just describing how the sort of amount of yield that the warmer regions could produce compared to those sort of more boutique wineries that were selling their wine grapes at higher prices. What that comparison was, and it was essential to establish this type of baseline that we could communicate this with people that weren't necessarily familiar with the field, or some of the trends within the wine industry that people outside of it wouldn't understand. So that was it was pretty well defined through GI regions to compare these climates, which was surprising, but it was it was quite difficult to tease out these types of clusters themselves. So it takes a lot of transformations for us to do that. The interesting thing about this is just the fact that the data is countrywide. So a lot of the academic studies we saw previous to this didn't have this level of data spanning this many regions and this many variables altogether. So that was quite unique with just creating these baselines for comparison. But more importantly, we can start asking, one of the questions I hear a lot is, what do I care about this? But The point was that we could then talk to the growers about this data and start asking questions about some of these variables out, some of these wineries that were really far away from this center mass of what everybody else is doing, why they're either underperforming or overperforming. So to answer this question, we just essentially asked growers. We started these workshops. We did a lot of discussions with growers about what can possibly go right and what can go wrong in the vineyard, what kinds of decisions they make day to day, and how that really affects it. Both we could then look at what people said within their sort of academic landscape. We could see what the discussions with the experts were really saying about what they were doing, and then we could look at the data and sort of get this idea across all three of them to say, well, this is what we think, and then we'd go back to the growers and ask them what they thought about all of that, so that we could really start to understand exactly what these relationships were, what things were conditional on other things. So especially yeah, it helped a lot to go out to these vineyards and then really get the discussion going. So part of the expert panel, that picture there is from Coonawarra. That's Hans on the right hand side. He was on our panel. What we really wanted to get from this was these limits of the data, so we can understand what we can describe, what we can't describe, and how well the data is actually describing things on the ground. And one of the biggest hookups we had with this was describing things that were adverse events, so bushfires, frost, sheep chewing on the irrigation pipelines was another one, but they weren't necessarily within the data, because if you were doing your Sustainable Wine Growing Australia and recording, only some of those adverse events were in there, but not all of them. So how do we piece this all together? We chose Bayesian Networks as our tool of choice. It's a particular method where you can sort of put all of your variables into these little bubbles. So you've got your electricity up here, there on the left in the green, and then you can create these conditional dependencies. So emissions is dependent. I'm not sure if you guys can see my cursor when I circle things, but it's on the left hand side there. Sorry, in green. Yeah, electricity is affects emissions. This is just this was one of our straw man models that we gave to the growers so they could take it apart and sort of cut their teeth on the idea behind all of this. And then you map out all of the things that you can consider important. So what we did also first start to show them was where the data existed within the SWA. So we have that in the green there, and then you can bring in external data into the data set, which we put into the gold. But importantly, we wanted to understand a lot of the decisions that the growers themselves made, what data they might have on the vineyard that they could help inform this further. So that's in the blue. So there's some obvious key factors there: water, fuel, pest, and disease. They came up again and again, but we wanted to really tease down into that. So what we did was we started with a general broad model for Australia, and then we sort of funneled it down into these regional models. You tend to try and be as broad as you can in the beginning. It was very much a sore point of the panel was the fact that you can't describe vineyard management in general, especially with the difference in climate across all the vineyards. So we looked at these cooler regions. So we picked Coonawarra, and then we picked the Riverland as two comparative regions. So that's sort of on the right, there's what they looked like in that original graph. So you've got that sort of bottom right type of management, and that top left. So you sort of very counterpoint to each other, very, very different climates, very different sort of operational decisions they were making. And we wanted to compare these, especially to see what types of decisions they made in different places, what types of decisions they made when they were sort of pursuing different outcomes from their vineyards as well. So this is essentially what I condemned them all to do. It's Hans on the night shift there on the right, using a little web app that we made to fill out these forms. So in order to create these Bayesian networks and then add that expert elicitation to them, they had to come up with a sort of ballpark numbers of how they thought things worked. So this is just a very basic example. It's not necessarily true. The water use affecting yield, you sort of say 40% of the time I use more water than I think on average. 60% I get below the mark, and then you sort of fill in these fields and say, if I'm using lots of water, what are the chances I think that I'm going to get high yield? It's just an example, but it also shows the discourse they had to go through in order filling out these Excel spreadsheets on spreadsheets of different numbers that they thought. Eventually, what we did, which they sort of call the burden of expert elicitation, we came up with some fancy algorithms so they could just rate relationships out of 10. So they could say, yeah, look, water use is 10 out of 10 important to yield. And then we could use some of the interpolation techniques to smooth out that between different outcomes. And then we could use a few of the other sort of properties of Bayesian networks to make that a bit easier for them to fill it out. But it did end up having lots of discussions with them. So I think this spanned about 18 months of these workshops with them. We were able to then use more literature to sort of compare what they were saying. And you know, it was really interesting at how accurate they were at scoring things out of 10 and how well they reflected a lot of known relationships. We did explore a lot of different types of other methods to help with this process that was quite arduous for them. Bard was one of them, which was just a method, a similar web app that I based this off of that the University of Melbourne came up with. The reason we actually had to create this web app in the first place too was a lot of this mathematics is in terms of the interpolation and these types of scoring things, as much as it looks simple to the outside world where you just create these little bubbles and then you draw arrows between them, there's a lot of different computational issues that can come along with this, a lot of computational optimizational issues that makes many of these systems what they call intractable, so you can't actually compute them across. The easiest way of thinking about it is if you look here at the water use affecting yield, you've got two variables there, and they've sort of got two different classes each, so high, low on both of them, and you end up with 4 in yield. If you go back to the graph here that we used as an example for the growers, as soon as you add sort of 5 or 6 variables to that, you sort of end up with way too many for people to realistically fill out themselves by hand. So you've got to actually adapt the entire system, which is why we came up with this rating by 10. Meant that you could kind of just give a rating for each one of the variables, and then you could work it all out based on a couple of different averages within the data. And if there wasn't data to sort of supply that type of average or the way in which the variables related, we could use the experts to just sort of give a ballpark and then sort of look at the literature again, look at what other people said about that, and then perform some calculations to figure out where it sort of lay. Yeah, in the end, this is one of the examples they came up with. So we looked at economic outputs and environmental outputs. You don't have to look too closely at the graph. It's very confusing, but they did over a great deal of time produce this graph essentially. So it was a lot of work for them. I really appreciate all of the effort they put in. And we also use some of the mathematics to create these connections between these sort of ideas when they were filling out the values. So what we could do was start to compare some of these economic outputs with the sort of environmental cost of them as well. And you can do this in a lot of different ways. They do this in risk management sometimes by putting dollar value to things. But in this, we were still just getting that idea from the growers about what they were looking at. But you can then sort of say the system itself in terms of the outcomes, in terms of the environmental and economic outcomes, they were sensitive to particular things. So looking at the Riverland, which is very similar still, although for very different reasons to the Coonawarra, had the same sensitivities and were connected. These environmental and these economic outcomes were connected by the same nodes. So fertilizer use, water use, fuel use were the ways in which that environmental and economic output fundamentally connected. So there were other connections, but these were the really important ones. And the sensitivities, of course, to seasonal conditions, weather and things like that, and the adverse events, which was a bit of a tough nut to crack in the end. But there was also a few nodes of importance within this when we were looking at it. So you can think of them almost as swing state nodes. Things like water use, it was essentially, you could kind of think of it in the way that a liter of water sort of would be detrimental equally to the environment as it would be of benefit to the bottom line for yield. So you kind of really deciding whether you wanted to invest in one or the other, but that also started to come out quite well within these scenarios we did assessments for. So what we did looking at these networks was create these scenarios, and generally you sort of look at what the best case scenario is, business as normal and worst case. In this instance, what we did was we looked at the climate. So we had a look at how climate would affect these interactions between the economy, sort of economic outputs, and these environmental outputs, and what people can do, what particular nodes the growers could control within the decisions they were making within the vineyard. And we decided to simulate essentially the non-ideal seasonal conditions within these systems, then extend that. So if the seasonal conditions got even worse, the nodes that the sort of weather would affect immediately. And then after that, we looked at these sort of pivot nodes, or these swing state nodes, and changed them either to, for the third scenario, they were given as the ideal outcomes. So if you could do the best you could, given the circumstance. And then in the fourth one, it was whether you were under all this sort of climactic pressure, but you still weren't able to actually do the best ideal outcome for your vineyard. So it's sort of, we were able to create, and I did get called out for this. They use this a lot in rugby to describe players' performance and compare teams and stuff. But I thought it was a great way to sort of look at these different scenarios. What we were able to show was really evident, and this was something that I found innately within the data when I first approached it, was just how adaptable wine growers are to adverse effects, and how well they can pivot, was one of the things that came out. But the thing was that we sort of started to discover was the cost of what that could be in the 10 to 20 years. So well and truly almost 10 years ago, I did do a lot of ecological studies in mathematics, and one of the problems you come across is that you need about 50 years of data to really describe how the environment will change over time. So you get these shocks, and then maybe 20 years later, you can have these sort of effects that are really detrimental and equally positive. So a lot of these sorts of intervention strategies, people say don't work, but they might work in 20 years. So it's really difficult to keep this data going and to really understand what's going on. But behind this, we could essentially see that people were able to maintain their great revenue, even given these sort of climactic pressures. But at very, very costly sort of approaches that they could do. So just by utilizing all of the different things that they know. So that would also, be a lot more use of the tractors, a lot more fuel use, changes in the way they do their fertilizer and their vineyard floor management, and what they really chose to do on the ground. But that was generally considered to be sort of costly in the soil degradation. So things like whether you can actually measure the effects of that sort of as ongoing or not. But there was, out of this, most importantly, what we wanted to capture was what we could do about that. If there was something we can do, if that was a real or perceived sort of adversity to the industry. And the workshop sort of described, we went through things like capital investment for more of those programs to help with soil remediation, or the adoption of better technologies, or the ability to subsidize some of the costs that would be incurred by that. But there is also a lot of research around this in terms of moving forward as an industry. I do implore people, if they're quite interested, to look at Kim Anderson's research. He did write quite a lengthy but very good report on the troubles of the wine industry at the end of last year that goes through a lot of this and a lot of the solutions. And there was a nice interlap between the two of them. So even though there was a few different points of contention between sort of what people would have described as useful and what other people would have described as useful, there's an agreement on things like the changes in policy to help wine growers, the idea that we can get more digital transformation so that people can have more accessible data and then compare the results of what they're getting out of different things. And most importantly, going even back to what I was saying about Maya, the ability to disseminate the results for things. So if somebody finds out something that's particularly useful and they can show that that's a useful thing to other people, the ability for all of the growers to then access that as a study, as a data, access the data for that study, so they can see for themselves what value they're really getting out of particular decisions, the ability for them to then make better choices between particular, even if it's a brand of or a buyer or seller. I think and there's in a more direct way, I can talk to some of the workshops just being a good spark, not necessarily the workshops sorry, the example I'm thinking of isn't necessarily a workshop that we were running for this particular piece, but just last week, I was running some workshops with a friend of mine talking to growers about the adoption of technology and just the ideas that people come up with between that. As simple as talking about how to post your wine and the better deals between Australia Post and some of the other corporations. People can save a lot of money, but unless you know about it, it's not something that you can achieve. So these sorts of tools to help people and to support them to understand the decisions they can make and the benefit of those decisions is really what this research is sought after. So that's that's everything for me. If anybody has any questions regarding that, that would be lovely.
Thanks, Bryce. Yeah, I'd just like to remind everyone, if they've got a question, you can type it in and down on the Q&A toolbar on the Zoom toolbar on your computer screen and send it through, and we should receive it. So there's been a couple of questions, Bryce. First one is, why was it so important that you used industry experts in your study?
Yeah, it's a good question. The industry experts, we use them just essentially because anyone who's going to understand the industry the best is going to be the experts, right? If you don't, I think it was best said by one of my supervisors a long time ago that if you do an analysis on a system that or a place essentially that you've never been to, then the analysis is essentially useless. So without that extra input from people who know exactly what they're doing, I think the study would be quite questionable.
Okay, there's another one. If we just follow that line of experts, did any of the experts talk about operations that they might change after going through the workshops? Did they learn anything that they didn't know before?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. There was because there was a lot of the workshops were to do with connecting the data to the decisions that they were making. There was, I think, and it's not well captured within the research that I've published and what I talked about here. But when I talked about the adverse events being a tough nut to crack, that I think would be a really good place to move forward with as well, because any type of risk that you can mitigate within a system. So understanding the sort of cost and what the time cost, what the monetary cost of things like irrigation failures in particular was one of the big points of talking. So you can have like an automated irrigation system, but what's the chance that it's not going to work? Because and even in other discussions I've had, you still have to check some of these automated irrigation systems to see if they are working. So if you've got if you were more well informed about things like that, like what the chances of failure actually was on some of the systems you were buying, and what the chance of these adverse events over a season actually would be, I'd say that was probably one of the biggest points in terms of talking and discovering about things. Like there was a sheep were one of the points there, in that you can get a lot of value out of them, but then if they chew up all your irrigation, what's the actual cost between the two? And that's, yeah, when I talked about the adverse events being a tough nut to crack, that's really what I meant. There's a lot of variables within that, and I think if I could go back, I would have made it like a subsystem just for those types of comparisons, whether it was worth adopting sheep in particular sized vineyards, or whether it was better in sort of smaller vineyards, and a few other types of pest control things like that, or just, I'm not really sure I'd call sheep pests, but some kind of control to prevent some prevention strategies, and whether they were worth it or not. It's a bit of a vague answer, sorry, but the discussions are pretty broad in that context. I think soil degradation was another very forefront one, because it's very difficult to measure and very, very vineyard specific. So unless you could really get these models down into that really specificity of what's going on, they wouldn't be as useful to everyone in a more, yeah, the more specific the models are, the more broadly they can be adopted, strangely, as counterintuitive as that sounds. Unless you've got one for your vineyard specifically, it's not as useful for you. But that's sort of the direction we're hoping to move into, so that we can develop that.
There's been a couple of data related questions. I'll read the first one to you. How do you recommend to record all of this data for fusing into decision making tools?
Yeah, that's I love that question. Sorry, that's too good. Yeah, they pay people so much money to do that. These types of tools, yeah, there's it's legitimately a career path of being a data engineer to make these tools in. I did do a lot of that prior to this. That was my job. Honestly, if you've got the data in a yeah, this is reading. This is a very hard question to answer, but it's such a good question because it really just highlights one of the biggest problems with data dissemination and informing people. So unless there's a platform at which people can sort of connect with each other and then see the data for themselves and then have the ability to analyze it in some way, that's a very, very difficult thing to overcome. But Sustainable Wine Growing Australia, just being a platform with data in it currently, is still one of the better ways you can do that, I think. But with improvements to systems like that, that would be really good going forward. I think that was one of the things that Anderson's work talks about.
There's just following on from the data question, there's another one talking about the temporality of the data. How old can the data be before it's considered suitable for a good model for the vineyard and wine industry?
Yeah, that's also a really good and age-old question within statistics. The thing is that it really depends on what the model's trying to capture. So this works in both ways. You've got an issue if your data is like, if we had data from 1000 BC about people trying to grow wine grapes, it's not really going to help us particularly much in the modern era because the techniques are completely different. So you need a point of comparison, but at the same time, the data needs to be, so the sort of Sustainable Wine Growing Australia had a hang up with the fact that the data is at the end of the season. So you're getting these snapshots of data, which isn't necessarily useful for some decisions, which like the growers highlighted in the workshops, that some of the last few weeks of the season can be critical, whether you harvest at particular points and whether there's a heat wave that just wipes out your crop quite brutally. So it depends specifically on the questions you want to answer. And that also, in terms of whether you can think of it as an inverse in terms of if you've got a control group versus like if you were trying to do a study and you looked at a hypothesis and were like, this is different to that. If you have a particular event in history that you can say, well, here's the invention of the tractor, our data past that compared to the data before that. So it depends what you're really trying to compare. So something like the soil degradation of your operations, unless you really changing what's being put into your soil over sort of a 20-year period, it doesn't really matter. Like, you want those longer studies for that sort of thing. But that's also why we do this data mining, because we're not entirely sure, what if there was something like a company messed up and they put some chemical in the fertilizer, or something horrible happens in that 20-year study. You need to just know that. You need to know all the data around that. And that's why these a lot of these studies have so much data put into them, and it's sometimes just in case. So it's almost like we can be safe and then go back and see where the point was that people started using this corrupt fertilizer or something along those lines to sort of highlight it. So yeah, very difficult question to answer for lots of different circumstantial reasons. But yeah, sorry, I feel like that was a terrible answer to your question, but I hope it helped, because yeah.
Really interested in understanding the value of outliers. Is it a test of a Bayesian network utility that it can explain what is driving outliers?
Yeah. Look, yeah, that's a cool question. So it depends on the way in which you identify the outlier. So the outliers that I sort of highlighted there, we were using our general linear models to find them. And then the way in which you sort of make these outliers more of a friend to your model isn't necessarily, it's going to be more down to the sort of, I guess, statistician's approach. So Bayesian networks you can leverage outliers through the use of a lot of tools like utility functions, but haphazard to sort of recommend a particular method for outliers. I think in the best description I can give for that is what I yeah, one of the funnest things about this data set was never did I think I'd find one where it had such good commentary on all of the data points. So a lot of people wrote what happened during the seasons down, which actually helped with many of these outliers. One, in fact, infamously stuck with me where I think it was their nephew or something, fell asleep on the tractor and ran over a bunch of the vineyard posts and just ruined the crop that year. But they'd left it in the comments. That's the only reason I knew about it. They'd wrote like, yeah, grr, 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 my nephew destroyed half of the crop. And I was like, wow, that's, I mean, I removed that point from the data because it was a pretty big reason for having an outlier. But in terms of using these utility functions and grasping the reason behind them, and that being I feel like it's more in the spirit of the question, is using utility functions to inquire as to what benefit they were getting and what decision they were making. That one's very difficult unless you've got enough information surrounding the decisions they made. And that's why you bring in the experts. So you can talk to them and say, hey, look, we have this outlier and what they've done is essentially use no water, or they've done all this stuff here. How does that work in the context of a vineyard? And then scrape down specifically onto these outliers. So it's a case by case basis, but trying to really look at what people did, and then the benefit is less in identifying the outliers because they're pretty easy to find generally, but more looking at the outlier, looking at what they did, and then sort of applying what they did as a scenario to other vineyards is more the trajectory you would take with that, and say, well, if it is viable for this one person to use like 50% less water or less fertilizer or whatever they were doing, or if they were using some special whatever magical crop, how would that look if we put that into the average vineyard? What would the percentage gains be for people, and how would that actually affect a lot of these other variables that we're doing? So it's more about adapting the outliers that are positive. A lot of the negative outliers, it tended to be these adverse events. It really did. It wasn't so much that they were doing anything specifically wrong day to day, but more that they had a lot of difficulties through bushfires and some of that other stuff. So that was that was really difficult to sort of get a get a handle on, and why I think moving towards models that help explain these types of risks and what the fallout with them would be a lot more effective at dealing with those types of issues.
Okay, there's a couple of other questions come through. There's one here relating to behavioral science. Have you ever thought about linking your work to behavioral science? Do you know what other factors are that will prevent growers from making data-driven decisions?
Yeah. Actually, I got asked this by Marty about behavioral science. And you might notice if you think of sustainability and the triple bottom line, there's generally environment, economy, and social society or social. You've got the three P's: people, profit, and planet. And there's not a lot of people involved in our models, so there's no social element. And I think the real for I think it's sort of a strange issue with people adopting data-driven decisions, because the reality is that they generally do it in their own way. Either it's by gut feel or by a bunch of other things, but they're usually informed at least somewhat. I mean, certainly I've met some people that aren't, but there's a it. I gave that example of the spreadsheet to sort of illustrate that if you were just saying this worked and this didn't work, you're already creating this sort of this data-driven decision. It's whether you can adopt these more technological capabilities to make better use of a variety of data. I think that in its own right is I would love to see what behavioral scientists have to say about that, just because the uptake of new technologies. I mean, I'm not very good at it myself generally. I don't even really use social media or anything like that. So I only really have sympathy for people who don't do it. But yeah, no, I think adding in terms of decision theory, we as a mathematician and in these types of operational research problems, that's really removed from it. It's really about bottom line and what kind of corners we can cut and stuff, which is very counterintuitive to a lot of the original industrial research, which originated in Germany. And why people started taking weekends and things like that were because it was found that people were more productive if they had breaks. And if they had people would stay with companies because they'd have health insurance and things. So it is an incredibly important part of it. But unless I've got the data as my own particular trait of statistics, I can't do much about it. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's very critical in informing this.
Next question is, was the growing type included in the models, for example, organic, biodynamic? And if so, how did it relate to the outcomes?
Yeah. There was a few growing types that were included in the models. Um, Most unfortunately, some of them I had to remove from a couple of the models. So people who did dry growing, it's really difficult to model the relationships without water, and that was definitely a real problem. Um, some of the other types of growing, I could see whether they were organic, and it was sort of captured interestingly in the models. But I never actually classified them specifically by organic, whether they were dry, whether they were sustainable. I just looked at the data as a whole at the end. Um, there was a couple of reasons for that. One being it was difficult to, because the although you could see whether they were organic by looking at the individual vineyards, and potentially I could have classified them through the data, um, you were at risk of sort of misclassifying people because I didn't have the explicit data on whether they were those types of growers. But you could see it, and it did affect some of the types of relationships that we found. So there was it also helped in an odd way to look at some things. So that's one of the reasons we look at fuel use over tractor passes and sprays, because it was a better indicator of how much work was being done in the vineyard, and it was more universal in the sense of whether you're spraying or whether you're doing mechanical weeding or whether you're doing all of these other activities, it was better described by fuel. And so I instead of embracing that difference in types of growers, I looked for a more general point of relation that I could create to describe what was happening in the vineyard as opposed to comparing them. But I think that'd also be quite an interesting point. I think one of the things early on was that I wanted to do, but we just didn't go down that path, was sort of compare how much, like whether there was a good economic benefit to just being organic, whether that was actually a viable option, or there was a whether that scaled well as well, like how well that would scale.
What was the data that told you that they were organic, Bryce? It was
Just the amount of sprays and things like that, which is sort of very difficult to, like I said, I could have tried to classify them in terms of how many pesticides and things they were using, but yeah, it would have been pretty flimsy as far as I was concerned, so I sort of abandoned that.
there's a sort of another question here relating to where to next. Where's the work going to go from here? And what question would you like to answer next based on your findings?
Yeah, I think this has become a bit of a passion project for me now, so I'd love to be able to actually move forward with, sorry, move forward with doing this on a more, because we sort of follow this funnel of general models and then sort of these regional models for comparison point, and that sort of worked well doing scenario assessment for these climatic effects. But moving forward where these decisions are a little bit more on the ground and more specific to a vineyard or something along those lines would have been really good. And I'd love to be able to do that, because I know I actually very luckily saw a good operational research seminar yesterday from the mining industry. So where they're going with this type of modeling is they move forward with how they can make their entire operation efficient. So where they have the sort of mining front, where the trucks connect and stuff. But as technology begins to get introduced into agriculture, like the automated tractors or something, even if they're coming within 50 years or whatever's happening with that, they need to interface with these types of decisions that growers are making on the ground. So there's sort of two major things that I'd love to achieve moving forward. That one is just the ability to retain this data for the next generation of growers, so they can see what decisions people were making, what the effects were when they sort of did those decisions, so that there's no real knowledge gap between when people hand over their vineyards to the new growers, and that we can really smoothly adopt these types of more sophisticated tools into the future, where they can just sort of almost seamlessly is the word I was looking for, seamlessly then connect to these types of models that we've already created and say, look, you need to be doing sprays this regular, and just have the track to go through and follow what people are doing on the ground, specifically over a season, and when that type of operation really works. Yeah.
There's another question that's linking to consumers. I'll just read it out to you. How do you think about sentiment analysis? Is there any data analysis for consumers?
Yeah, sentiment analysis. Oh, yeah, that my one of my bosses actually came from an organization called Data to Decisions. This is a while ago, and they did huge amounts of sentiment analysis. So I have a weird level of knowledge about it that's not necessarily through practice, but there's a lot of interesting sentiment analysis, and it would apply well to consumers. But strangely, if I, yeah, I think, yeah, strangely, the point which I come from sentiment analysis, a lot of it is tracking terrorist cells. So they do a lot of these sentiment analysis, and a lot of these, like, they do societal structures and how people become interact with each other and then become these radicals. So it's very weird to sort of say that, but it's exactly the same in terms of word of mouth for consumers. So it's like it all works the same. And there's a lot of researchers in Adelaide that do sentiment analysis and do these types of social structures and the interactions between people, and how they either become so the idea, and this is why it's a bit weird, I guess, the idea is they become segregated and radicalized from society, but it works the other way. So the algorithm finds it in the sense of they look for pockets of people that become isolated, but the algorithm can be sort of applied in the opposite manner, in which you can find how you would disseminate your product and then get that word of mouth going, and what the types of start you'd need. So there's a it's not it's weird, it's not my area of expertise, but I do know a weird amount about it, in the sense of there's a particular type of almost ignition to that. So you'd need something like a social media account with a certain amount of followers, say like 100,000, and then you'd have them talk about your product, and that would disseminate through. The type of sentiment analysis within that has been studied to be in quite perpetual, if that makes sense. So if you've got someone talking positive, and this is why the radicalization thing was my lean into it. Yeah, if you've got someone sort of famous talking positive about something, and then that leads to this dissemination of that positive idea, yeah, you can perpetuate it quite effectively. But yeah, don't get me to do that. As you can tell, I don't really know much about it. Actually enacting it, I just know the theoretical. I know the mathematics behind it. Like, it's not in terms of enacting your sentiment analysis and then getting bang for your buck. I'm always really haphazard about the effectiveness of that, but apparently it works really well. That you can really, they do it a lot in political science as well. So I think the teams that do that sort of stuff are very expensive, though, but I'm not entirely sure.
All right. And one final question. The key learnings from your work, how do we take these to more growers, and what would the key message be?
The key message, geez, I got asked that one just a couple of weeks ago with my Viper defense. So yeah, it's the real key message is, and I guess if I want to, there's a couple of different ways I can answer it, but I think I'll go more in my personal sort of takeaway from it, as opposed to the sort of academic defense I did a couple of weeks ago. And that really was that I was surprised when I got handed this data set, just how good wine growers were at this adapting to problems. But the problem is in that describing those solutions to other people and then getting those solutions out there. So that way, if something does happen in a season and it's maybe not the first time or it's more severe than it's been before, because you can't Google it. You can't just go, oh, look, my vine's got these problems, or you know, like the degrees in weather are beyond what they normally would be. Another region might have experienced this in the past and might actually have a bunch of solutions for people. And I think just really, even if the only thing that comes out of this is people having that ability to talk to one another more about how they overcame a lot of these problems, that would be a major win, I think, really. Just and then getting that access of people to more data so that they can better describe it and then plan for the future. That's really where I think the benefit is from. There are a lot of other things that, like in terms of more dryly, like the scenarios are helpful for planning and things like that, and they show future problems that are prevalent and people might need to sort of overcome before they become real problems. But yeah, it's really more, I think, about that dissemination of the ability to overcome different problems. That if that was the key takeaway, is that people need to talk to each other more, and they need to really have a forum in which they can do that and help each other overcome these adversities.
All right. So that's quite a comprehensive question and answer session. Look, thank you, Bryce, for taking us on a mathematical journey this morning or this afternoon with sustainable wine growing data and a different way to look at it with great potential. I'm sure everyone who attended got a lot out of the session. I'd also like to thank the audience for logging in, taking part, and just also remind you that, as always, you will receive a link to the recording of this presentation, which will be available on the Adabrise YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. The next Adabrise webinar is going to be on the 5th of June with a webinar titled Developing Pest-Resistant and Climate-Resilient Rootstocks. So look out for this advertisement, which will be coming soon. So if you'd like to register, just please visit the Adabrise website. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you all at the next Adabrise webinar. Have a good day.